John Reynolds stood in his spacious apartment, gazing out over the neon-lit skyline of New York City. It was the year 2150, and the city buzzed with the energy of humanity's advancements. In the past few decades, Earth had established diplomatic relations with several alien species, and it wasn't uncommon to see alien citizens working side by side with humans. Despite all the progress, John felt a deep emptiness inside. A successful engineer at a high-tech company, he had everything he could possibly want. Except for one thing: companionship. After years of long hours at work, John realized that he was losing touch with people. His friends had moved on with their lives, and he rarely had time to connect with others. He didn't know how it had come to this, but he was starting to feel isolated. The constant hustle of corporate life and his demanding job left him with little time for anything else. He had always been too focused on his career, too driven to be the best. But now, in the quiet of his apartment, the loneliness felt heavier than ever. That's when he saw the advertisement for personal service assistants, a program offering alien maids to humans, designed to cater to the needs of busy professionals. John hesitated for a moment, unsure if the idea was right for him. An alien maid. But he was desperate, and something about the idea intrigued him. The next day, he signed up for the service. Within hours, he received a message confirming the arrival of his new maid. Her name was Tyra, an alien from Veritas, a planet known for its peaceful inhabitants and advanced technology. Her species was humanoid, though she had distinct features that set her apart from humans: shimmering green skin, long silver hair, and glowing eyes that seemed to hold an ancient wisdom. When Tyra arrived at his apartment, John was immediately struck by her calm presence. She didn't speak much, but her graceful movements and keen intelligence were apparent in the way she moved around the room. She didn't need to ask questions or be told what to do. She seemed to know exactly what needed attention. Her efficiency was unmatched, and John found himself marveling at how quickly she transformed his apartment into a clean, organized space. Over the next few days, John grew accustomed to having Tyra around. At first, their interactions were limited to polite exchanges. She would ask if he needed anything, and he would thank her in return. But as time went on, their conversations began to deepen. She shared stories of her home planet, her culture, and the way her people valued peace and harmony. John listened intently, fascinated by the differences between their worlds. Tyra, for her part, seemed just as intrigued by Earth. She would ask John questions about human history, technology, and the complex emotions that humans experienced. John, though often reluctant to open up, found himself talking to her in ways he hadn't with anyone in years. Her curiosity was refreshing, and for the first time in a long while, John felt like someone truly cared about his thoughts. One evening, as John returned from work, he found Tyra sitting on the couch, reading one of his books. She looked up as he entered, her glowing eyes meeting his with a hint of a smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said softly, her voice like music to his ears. "No, not at all," John replied, his heart unexpectedly racing. "What are you reading?" She held up the book, a science fiction novel about an intergalactic war. "I find this fascinating," she said. "Your species has such a vivid imagination." John smiled, taking the seat next to her. They began discussing the book, and before long, the conversation shifted to more personal topics. He found himself talking about his work, his childhood, and the struggles he faced trying to balance his career with his need for connection. Tyra listened intently, offering gentle words of wisdom. There was something about her that made him feel understood, something beyond the surface. It was as if she could see through him, into the parts of himself he had long forgotten. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between them grew stronger. John found himself looking forward to their conversations more than anything else in his life. He was drawn to Tyra in a way he couldn't explain. Her beauty was undeniable, but it wasn't just her physical appearance that captivated him. It was her intelligence, her kindness, and the way she seemed to see the world in a completely different light. One evening, after a long day at work, John sat down on the couch, exhausted. Zaira joined him, as she always did, her presence soothing after the chaos of his day. Without thinking, John reached out and gently touched her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a spark. Zaira looked at him, her glowing eyes locking onto his. There was a moment of silence, and then she spoke softly. "John, I am not like the humans you know." He smiled. "I know." They didn't speak for a few moments, but the air between them seemed to thrum with something unspoken, something powerful. John wasn't sure where it was going, but he knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. Days turned into weeks, and the connection between John and Zaira only deepened. What started as polite conversations and small gestures had slowly transformed into something more intense. The quiet moments they shared, whether discussing books or simply enjoying each other's company, began to feel like a lifeline to John. He hadn't realized how much he'd been missing until Zaira had entered his life. John couldn't deny it anymore. He was attracted to her. It wasn't just the way she looked, though her shimmering green skin and silver hair were undeniably captivating. It was the way she made him feel, alive, seen, and appreciated in ways he hadn't felt in years. Her intelligence, her quiet strength, and the way she spoke about her home planet all drew him in like a magnet. But there was something about Zaira that made John hesitate. She wasn't just an alien. She was a servant, hired to help with his household. Their relationship, no matter how innocent it might have seemed, carried risks. Cultural taboos, legal implications, and societal expectations that John could not ignore. Earth and Veritas had only just begun to navigate the complexities of interspecies relations, and a human-alien romance was considered not just rare, but forbidden. Zaira seemed to sense his conflict. She was just as drawn to him as he was to her, but she too understood the dangers. She was a member of a proud, ancient species, and while Veritas valued peace and acceptance, it didn't mean that interspecies relationships were accepted without question. Her people believed in maintaining their own traditions, and while some humans were open-minded, others would view this relationship as a betrayal of her culture. Yet, despite the barriers between them, they couldn't stop what was happening. Their conversations grew more intimate, their touches more frequent. John found himself stealing glances at her, admiring the way her eyes seemed to glow with an inner light whenever she spoke. She, too, seemed to be affected by his presence. When they were together, the world outside seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them in a quiet bubble of connection. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, John noticed how close they were. Zaira had positioned herself beside him, her presence warm and comforting. The space between them had closed, and he could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing beside him. It was then that he realized just how much he longed to touch her, not just in a casual way, but in a way that went deeper, a way that conveyed the feelings he hadn't yet put into words. He reached out slowly, almost instinctively, and placed his hand on hers. Zaira's eyes widened, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. John could hear the beating of his own heart in his ears, the tension between them palpable. He had never felt so unsure of anything in his life, yet at the same time, he had never felt so certain. Zaira turned her hand in his, gently threading her fingers through his. "John, this is dangerous," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He looked at her, his gaze softening. "I know," he said quietly, "but I can't ignore what I feel. I've never felt this way before." Zaira's expression softened, and she looked down at their hands. "Neither have I. But I'm not like you. My people have different ways. They would not understand." John nodded, his heart sinking. He knew the risks they were taking. If anyone found out, it could ruin them both. But in that moment, with her hand in his, the world outside didn't matter. It was just the two of them, sharing something they couldn't explain. "I don't care what they think," John said softly, his voice low but determined. "I care about you, Kyra. You've brought something into my life I didn't even know I was missing." Zyra's eyes flickered with a mixture of emotions, fear, longing, and something else that John couldn't quite place. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, he leaned in, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a gentle kiss, tentative at first, but then more urgent, as if their bodies knew what their minds were still unsure of. The kiss sent a shiver through John, a jolt of electricity that made him forget all the worries, all the fears he had been carrying. It was like the entire universe had faded away, leaving only the two of them in this shared moment. He pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, his hands moving to cup her face. Thyra responded in kind, her hands finding their way to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart under her touch. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, their foreheads touching. They didn't speak for a long time, each processing the magnitude of what had just happened. The silence between them was filled with unspoken words, emotions they didn't know how to express. Finally, Zyra spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what this means, John. I don't know where this will go." John smiled gently, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. "Neither do I. But I know that I don't want to stop." For the first time in what felt like forever, John didn't feel lost. He didn't feel alone. But with that realization came a new sense of fear, a fear of what would happen if their secret came to light. Would they be able to protect this fragile connection, or would it all come crashing down before they even had a chance to understand it? As the night wore on, neither of them had the answer. But for that moment, in the quiet of John's apartment, they were content simply being with each other. No rules, no expectations, just the warmth of their connection. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was enough. The days after their kiss were a blur of mixed emotions. John and Sarek continued to share quiet moments together, their connection growing stronger with each passing day. They talked about everything: earthly topics, Viridan customs, hopes, and dreams, but there was always an undercurrent of uncertainty. They both knew the relationship could not stay secret forever. The risk of being discovered hung over them like a storm cloud, but neither of them seemed ready to let go of the bond they had formed. John's mind was consumed with thoughts of Tyra. No matter how much he tried to focus on his work, he couldn't shake the image of her face, her touch, the warmth of her presence. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, an intelligent, thoughtful being who made him feel things he had long forgotten how to feel. But with that came guilt. There were so many barriers between them: cultural differences, the prejudice of their respective species, and the simple fact that they came from different worlds. It was a relationship that could tear both of their lives apart. Zyra, too, struggled with the situation. She had never allowed herself to get so close to a human. Her people, while open-minded, held their traditions sacred. Interspecies relationships were still seen as taboo, even if they were becoming more common. Ira was torn between her feelings for John and her duty to her people. She knew that if anyone found out about their growing bond, she could be ostracized, and John could face severe consequences as well. The thought of losing him, however, felt unbearable. She could not deny that she had fallen for him. One evening, as they sat together in John's living room, a quiet knock at the door startled them both. John's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea who it could be. He had been so careful to keep their relationship hidden. He stood up quickly, wiping his palms on his pants, trying to hide the nervous tension that gripped him. "I'll get it," John said, hoping it was just a delivery or a neighbor. But as soon as he opened the door, he froze. Standing in front of him was a woman in a crisp, military-like uniform. Her expression was stern, her eyes sharp. She was a representative of the Earth Interspecies Relations Council, an organization that oversaw interactions between humans and other species. Behind her, two more figures in similar uniforms stood at attention. "Mr. Reynolds, we need to speak with you," the woman said coldly, stepping into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. John's stomach twisted. He could feel the weight of their presence in the room, and suddenly, everything felt too real. Thyra remained seated on the couch, her face unreadable, but John could see the tension in her posture. The last thing they needed was for anyone to find out about their relationship. "What's this about?" John asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman's eyes flicked to Sarah briefly before returning to John. "We've received reports of an unauthorized relationship between a human and an alien. Mr. Reynolds, we are here to investigate." John's heart sank. The worst-case scenario had arrived. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out, a way to protect Thyra from the consequences of their actions. He couldn't let them take her away. "I don't know what you're talking about," John said, his voice firm but trying not to sound suspicious. "Zara is just my maid. She's been helping me with my home, nothing more." The woman narrowed her eyes but didn't say anything for a moment. She studied him, as if trying to gauge whether he was lying. "We've also been informed that there are unusual patterns in your recent communications, Mr. Reynolds. It's our duty to look into these matters." John cursed himself internally. He had been so careful, but somehow someone had noticed the late-night conversations, the strange behavior. There was no way he could hide it now. His eyes flicked to Thyra, who was staring at the floor, clearly unsure of what to do next. This was bad. Very bad. "We're going to need to question you both," the woman said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. John felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't let them take Thyra. He couldn't let them destroy everything he had come to care about. He needed a plan, and fast. "I've already told you. There's nothing between us," John said, his voice shaking slightly despite his efforts to stay calm. "Zara is my maid. She has been hired to assist me with my work. Nothing else." The woman didn't respond immediately, but her gaze lingered on Thyra. "We'll see about that." John felt a knot tighten in his chest. There was no convincing them with words. If they didn't believe him, they could do more than just question him. They could destroy Thyra's life and his own. The consequences would be severe. As the military representative began to step forward, something inside John snapped. He couldn't just stand there and let this happen. He wouldn't. In a sudden burst of courage, John stepped between the officer and Thyra, blocking her view. "You can't do this," he said firmly. "Thyra has done nothing wrong. I am responsible for any misunderstanding, and I'm telling you the truth." For a moment, there was only silence. The officers exchanged glances, uncertain. John's heart pounded in his chest, but he held his ground. He wasn't going to let them tear apart the fragile connection he had built with Thyra. He couldn't. "Please," he added, his voice softer now, "give us a chance to explain. You don't understand." The lead officer hesitated. Something in John's voice seemed to make her pause. But whether it was fear, respect, or uncertainty, John didn't know. All he knew was that, for now, the storm had not broken yet. The air in the room was thick with tension. John stood between the officers and Thyra, his heart racing. The lead officer, who had introduced herself as Commander Larson, still seemed unsure. She eyed him carefully, her gaze flickering between him and Thyra. The other two officers stood silently, their expressions stern but unreadable. John's mind was racing, his thoughts darting back and forth as he tried to figure out what to do next. He couldn't afford to lose Thyra. Not now. He had grown too close to her, too dependent on her presence in his life. The connection between them was more than physical attraction. It was real. But the authorities wouldn't care about that. They would only see a violation of the law, an illegal relationship between a human and an alien. "Mr. Reynolds," Commander Larson said slowly, her voice firm but not unkind, "we're aware that your interaction with Ms. Zara has been close, and we understand that you may have emotions involved, but you must realize this situation cannot continue unchecked. There are regulations in place for a reason." John's throat tightened. He knew what she meant. interspecies relationships, especially between humans and members of the Viridin species, were strictly controlled. The authorities had rules to ensure that such relationships didn't lead to conflict, that they didn't disrupt the social and cultural balance between species. But none of that mattered to John in that moment. All he cared about was keeping Cyrus safe. "Please," John said, his voice shaking slightly. "You don't understand. Zaira isn't just a maid to me. She's more than that." He turned to Zaira, his eyes softening. "You mean more than that to me." Zaira's face remained calm, but John could see the subtle tightening of her features. She was worried, just as he was. They both knew that speaking openly about their feelings could lead to even more trouble. The idea of revealing their bond in full could result in Zaira's deportation or worse. But she had always been brave, and John could feel her steady presence beside him, grounding him. Commander Larson looked at the two of them with a neutral expression. "What you're suggesting is that there's more to this situation than meets the eye." "That could be true, but you must understand that we have a responsibility to maintain order. The Earth Interspecies Relations Council has protocols for these kinds of situations. We cannot simply ignore the law." John took a deep breath. "I know about the laws," he said quietly, "but I also know that love isn't something that can be controlled by regulations. Zaira has been nothing but kind and helpful to me. She's made me realize things I never knew about myself. We formed a bond that goes beyond anything the law can define." There was a long pause. The officers remained silent, their eyes fixed on John and Zaira. The tension in the room was unbearable. Finally, Commander Larson spoke again. "Mr. Reynolds," she said slowly, "I can see that you believe this bond to be genuine. But we need to be sure. If we allow this relationship to continue, we must be certain it does not cause harm to either you or Ms. Zaira. There are diplomatic and legal concerns that cannot be ignored." John nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He wasn't asking for the rules to be broken. He simply wanted the chance to explain, to make the authorities see that this wasn't some fleeting attraction. It was real. "I'm not asking you to ignore the rules," John said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm asking for understanding. Zaira and I are both adults. We both know the risks, but we're willing to face them together." Commander Larson studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed his words. John could see the conflict in her eyes. She was a professional, bound by duty to uphold the law. But she was also a human being, and John's words had struck a chord with her. "All right," she said finally. "We will give you both a chance to explain. But be warned, this is your one opportunity. If we find any evidence of misconduct or a breach of protocol, there will be consequences." John's heart skipped a beat. "Thank you," he said, trying to hide the relief in his voice. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. There was still a chance, a small one, but a chance nonetheless. However, Commander Larson continued, "We will need to conduct an investigation. We'll need both of you to cooperate fully." Zaira nodded, though John could see the nervousness in her eyes. She was still unsure how far the authorities would go in their investigation. This wasn't just a matter of legal consequences. It was about their futures, their lives. John's heart clenched at the thought of what might happen if things went wrong. "We will cooperate," John said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty bubbling inside him. Commander Larson gave him a curt nod. "Good. We'll be in touch with you soon. Until then, we expect your full cooperation." With that, the officers turned and left, leaving John and Zaira standing in the living room, their hands still clasped together. The door clicked shut behind them, and the weight of the situation settled back in. The tension between them was palpable, but there was also a glimmer of hope. "I don't know what will happen next," John said softly, his eyes meeting Zaira's. "But I'm not giving up on us. No matter what happens, I want you to know that." Zaira's eyes softened, and she reached up to gently touch his face. "I don't know either," she said quietly, "but I trust you. Whatever happens, we will face it together." For a moment, they simply stood there, the world outside fading away. In that small bubble of space, it didn't matter what laws governed their worlds. It didn't matter what others thought. All that mattered was the quiet promise between them, a promise that no matter what the future held, they would stand by each other. And for the first time in days, John allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. The following days felt like a slow burn, each one stretching out longer than the last. John and Sarah knew the investigation was coming. They had no idea how long it would take or what the outcome would be, but they couldn't escape the fact that their secret was no longer safe. They had to be cautious, yet they both felt the weight of what was happening. Sarah continued with her daily tasks as usual, but the atmosphere between her and John had shifted. It was hard to pretend that everything was normal, where they both knew that the truth was hanging over them like a dark cloud. They didn't talk much about what might happen next, but when their eyes met, the unspoken understanding was clear. They were in this together, but they were also in danger. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the apartment, John found himself staring out the window, lost in thought. He was trying to keep his mind occupied, but it was impossible. The council's investigation was not something he could ignore. What if they found something? What if they turned on Kyra, or worse, turned on him? He heard the soft rustle of fabric behind him and turned to find Kyra standing there. Her silver hair glowed in the dim light, and her eyes, always so calm, now held a hint of worry. He could see the toll the stress was taking on her. "John," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." He stepped closer to her, his heart heavy. "What's on your mind?" Kyra hesitated for a moment, as if she were trying to find the right words. Finally, she spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what happens next. The investigation. I don't know if we can hide this much longer. Even if they don't find anything, the suspicion is enough to tear us apart." John's chest tightened. He had been trying not to think about the worst-case scenarios, but now, hearing Kyra voice her concerns, he couldn't ignore them any longer. "I won't let them take you away from me," he said, his voice firm. "I don't care what happens. You're the only thing that matters to me right now." Kyra's eyes softened, but she still looked uncertain. "But what if they find something? What if they uncover the truth?" Her voice trembled slightly. "John, I don't want you to lose everything for me." He took her hands in his, holding them tightly. "Kyra, I've already decided. I won't let anything happen to you. We'll face whatever comes together. We'll find a way to make this work." She searched his face, as if looking for any hint of doubt. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. "I trust you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "But I can't help feeling that this is going to end badly." John kissed her forehead gently. "Don't think like that. I know it's risky, but I believe in us, and I believe in what we have." For a brief moment, Kyra allowed herself to relax into his embrace. But the reality of their situation was never far from her mind. They had no idea what the council might do. The investigation could lead to anything, from a slap on the wrist to something much worse. But they both knew they had no choice but to keep moving forward. As the days passed, John found himself growing more paranoid. He couldn't stop checking his messages, wondering if he'd hear from the authorities again. Every time the doorbell rang, his heart would skip a beat, and every knock seemed louder than the last. They were under surveillance now, whether they knew it or not. One afternoon, while John was working on his laptop, he heard the unmistakable sound of a knock at the door. His heart thudded in his chest. He quickly stood up, but before he could reach the door, Kyra was already there, moving quickly but quietly. Her instincts were sharp, and she knew that they couldn't afford to be caught off guard. John watched as she opened the door, her posture perfect and her expression neutral. Standing outside was a man, dressed in civilian clothing, but with a familiar air of authority about him. His eyes immediately flicked to Syra before turning back to John. "Mr. Reynolds, I'm Officer Van. I'm here to ask a few questions regarding the ongoing investigation." John's stomach twisted. He forced a smile, trying to appear calm despite the sudden rush of panic. "Of course. Come in, Officer Van." Van stepped into the apartment without waiting for further invitation, his eyes scanning the room quickly. John led him to the living room and gestured for him to sit. Syra remained standing by the door, her presence still strong but distant. "I won't keep you long," Officer Van said, his tone cool. "We've been reviewing the evidence, and we need to ask you a few more questions. Please be honest. This is your last opportunity to cooperate fully." John felt his throat tighten. He knew what was coming. The walls were closing in, and he had to be careful. Every word, every gesture mattered now. He looked at Syra, and she gave him a small, reassuring nod. She trusted him, but he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the charade. "We've received reports that you've been in close contact with Ms. Syra," Officer Van continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Can you explain the nature of your relationship with her?" John's mind raced. He had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, he found himself at a loss for words. He couldn't lie, not outright, but he also couldn't tell the full truth. What if they found out? What if they took Syra away from him? "I've already told you," John said slowly, trying to sound convincing. "Syra is my maid. She helps me with my household. But that's all. There's nothing more to it." Van raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Nothing more? Are you sure?" John could feel the sweat building on his palms. The tension in the room was suffocating. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew that he couldn't back down now. The truth was dangerous, but his feelings for Syra were undeniable. He wasn't ready to give up on them. "Absolutely sure," John replied, forcing his voice to stay steady. For a moment, Officer Van just stared at him, his eyes searching, as if he could see right through him. Then, with a small sigh, he stood up. "I'll be in touch, Mr. Reynolds. Don't make the mistake of hiding anything from us." As Officer Van left, the weight of the investigation grew heavier. John and Syra were left in silence, both of them knowing that this was only the beginning. What would the council do next? They didn't know, but they knew one thing for sure. The lies they were living could only hold up for so long. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure only grew heavier. The investigation continued, but John and Syra still had no idea what the authorities were planning. The officers had come and gone, asking questions, reviewing their interactions, looking for any sign of wrongdoing. The constant uncertainty was wearing them both down. Every knock on the door, every phone call, made John's heart race with dread. Syra had become more withdrawn, her usual calm demeanor now tinted with anxiety. It was hard for her to keep up the act that everything was fine when she knew it wasn't. She had always been taught to put duty above everything else. But now, her duty was to John, and that conflicted deeply with everything she had been raised to believe. John had tried to stay strong, but the weight of the investigation was taking its toll on him too. His thoughts were consumed with Syra's safety, and he had begun to feel the walls closing in around him. No matter how carefully they tried to hide their feelings, the truth was becoming harder to bury. Every day they spent together felt like one step closer to being exposed. One evening, as John sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it, Syra entered the room. She was quiet, her presence soft but undeniable. He looked up at her, his mind already tired from worrying about everything that was happening. "John," Syra said, her voice low, "we need to talk." John's stomach twisted. He knew the conversation was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. He pushed his chair back and stood up. "What's on your mind?" Syra hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "I think it's time for us to leave," she said softly. "We can't keep hiding. It's only a matter of time before the council figures out everything. I don't want you to get hurt because of me. John's breath caught in his chest. The idea of leaving, of running away, had crossed his mind more than once, but hearing Xyra say it out loud made the reality of it hit him like a punch to the gut. No, he said, shaking his head. I'm not leaving. Not without you. Xyra looked away, her expression unreadable. But it might be the only way to protect us both. I could disappear. I could go somewhere far away, where no one would find me. You could stay here, and maybe they would forget about all of this. John took a step closer to her, grabbing her hands gently. We've already made it this far. I won't let them separate us now. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Tears welled up in Xyra's eyes, but she blinked them back quickly. I don't want you to suffer because of me, she whispered, almost to herself. I don't want them to take you away. The weight of her words hit John harder than he expected. He had been so focused on protecting Xyra that he hadn't thought about the toll this was taking on her. She wasn't just afraid of losing him. She was afraid of the consequences of their relationship. They both knew that the council had the power to take everything from them. It wasn't just a matter of being discovered. It was a matter of survival. I won't let that happen, John said firmly. You mean too much to me. We're in this together, Xyra, and I will do whatever it takes to protect you. Xyra closed her eyes for a moment, her breath shaky. She had always been so composed, so strong, but now she was allowing herself to feel the fear she had been holding inside. The thought of losing John, of facing the unknown alone, was unbearable. Promise me something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What? John asked, his tone soft. Promise me you'll stay safe. No matter what happens, take care of yourself. I don't want to lose you, John. The sincerity in her voice tore at his heart. He nodded, pulling her into a gentle embrace. I promise. I won't leave you, Xyra. We'll figure this out together. As they stood there, holding each other, there was a knock on the door. The sound was sharp and sudden, interrupting the fragile moment they had shared. John's heart leaped in his chest, the fear returning in full force. He pulled away from Xyra, his mind racing. Who could it be? Xyra asked, her voice laced with anxiety. Do you think they've found us? John's hand was already on the doorknob before he could answer. He had to know who it was. His heart pounded in his ears as he opened the door. Standing in the doorway was Officer Van, his face expressionless. Behind him stood two more officers, their eyes scanning the room, their posture stiff. Mr. Reynolds, Officer Van said coolly, we need to speak with you again. This time, it's urgent. John's stomach twisted into knots. He couldn't hide his fear, no matter how hard he tried. He glanced at Xyra, whose face had gone pale. The officers stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, their eyes darting around the apartment, as though searching for something. Anything. What's this about? John asked, trying to sound calm. His mind raced for answers. He had to keep control of the situation. He had to protect Xyra. We've been following up on the investigation, Officer Van replied. And we have new information. We need both of you to come with us. It's not a question. Xyra stiffened beside him, her hands trembling. John took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't let them take her. Not now. No, he said, his voice firm. You can't take her. Officer Van raised an eyebrow. Mr. Reynolds, you don't understand the gravity of the situation. If you do not cooperate, there will be consequences. This is your final warning. John's mind was spinning. What were they going to do to them? Was this the end? He looked at Xyra, her eyes full of fear, but there was also a glimmer of something else. Determination. She wasn't going down without a fight. Neither of them was. We'll go with you, John said, his voice steady. But you're not taking her. Not without me. The officers exchanged glances, but they didn't respond. The tension in the room was unbearable. It was clear that everything was about to change. The tension in the air was thick, and every second felt like it might be their last. John stood firm, his body tense as he faced Officer Van and the other two officers who had entered his apartment. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but one thing was certain. He wasn't about to let them take Zyra without a fight. Zyra stood beside him, her expression unreadable, but John could feel the fear radiating from her. She had always been strong, but even she couldn't hide the fact that they were both in deep trouble. Their lives were on the line, and there was no going back. "We need to go with you," John said, his voice steady but with an underlying intensity. He locked eyes with Officer Van. "But you're not taking her without me. If we're going to face whatever this is, we're doing it together." For a long moment, Officer Van didn't say anything. He simply stared at John, then shifted his gaze to Zyra. She had a quiet strength about her, but even she knew that this was the moment where everything could change. "You're making a mistake," Van said finally, his voice cold. "You don't fully understand the gravity of the situation. This is bigger than you." John's heart raced, but he didn't flinch. "I don't care how big it is. I won't let you separate us." The other officers stood silent, their faces expressionless as if waiting for their commander's orders. Officer Van seemed to weigh his options carefully. John knew they could try to arrest him, try to force him into submission, but he couldn't let them take Zyra. Not like this. "What happens next?" Zyra asked quietly, her voice shaking slightly. She was doing her best to stay composed, but even she couldn't hide the uncertainty. Officer Van looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "We take you both in for questioning. The council has decided that you are both a risk to interspecies relations, and we need to confirm your intentions before any further action is taken." John felt a cold chill at the words. A risk? To what? He wasn't sure, but what he did know was that this wasn't about just following the law. It was about control, about power, and the authorities were prepared to do whatever it took to keep them in line. "No," John said firmly. "We won't go with you willingly. You can't just take us like this." Before Van could respond, John quickly reached for his phone on the table. His fingers moved rapidly as he sent a message to his lawyer. He knew he had to act fast. The more time they spent here, the more likely they were to be detained without cause. He needed someone on his side, someone who could fight this for him. Zyra glanced at him, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. She knew he was trying to help, but deep down, she also knew that time was running out. "John," Zyra whispered, her voice tinged with worry. "I don't think we have much time. They're not going to just let us go." He met her gaze, his eyes filled with determination. "We'll find a way. I'm not letting them tear us apart." The officers didn't move as John sent the message. The silence in the room felt suffocating, like the calm before a storm. Van finally stepped forward, his face hard. "We have orders, Mr. Reynolds. If you resist, we'll have no choice but to detain you. I suggest you think carefully about your next move." John stood tall, his mind racing. He was determined to keep Zyra safe, no matter the cost. But the reality was sinking in. The council had the power to make their lives impossible, and if they weren't careful, this could be the beginning of the end for both of them. At that moment, John's phone buzzed in his pocket. His heart skipped a beat. He quickly checked the message. It was from his lawyer. "Stay calm. I'm on my way. Don't let them take you." A wave of relief washed over him, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. The officers had their orders, and they weren't going to back down easily. He had to keep them talking, stall for as much time as possible. "We're not going anywhere until we've spoken with our lawyer," John said, his voice firm. He could feel the tension building in the room as the officers exchanged wary looks. "Do you really think that will stop us?" Van asked, his tone laced with disbelief. "You're only making this worse for yourself." "We'll see," John replied, his eyes unwavering. He had to hope that his lawyer could buy them the time they needed, that they could find a way out of this mess. Minutes later, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. John's heart pounded. He knew this was their chance. The door opened, and in walked his lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, dressed in a sleek black suit. She gave a quick nod to John before turning her attention to the officers. "Officer Van," she said coolly, "I trust you've been treating my clients with the respect they deserve." Van's expression hardened. "This is an official investigation, Ms. Clark. Your clients are under suspicion, and they are to come with us immediately." Miss Clark didn't flinch. "I believe you are overstepping your boundaries, officer. My clients are entitled to legal representation, and they will not be going anywhere without me." For a moment, it seemed like an impasse. The officers stood still, eyeing each other, trying to assess the situation. Then finally, Van spoke again, though his voice was less confident than before. "We'll have to take this up with the council. But know this, if you delay this any further, we will escalate the situation." Ms. Clark nodded. "You do what you have to do. But we will not be bullied into compliance." The officers exchanged one last glance before Officer Van sighed and turned toward the door. "We'll be in contact," he said curtly, before the group filed out of the apartment, leaving John and Tyra standing in stunned silence. It wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time in weeks, John allowed himself to breathe a little easier. They had bought themselves some time, but they knew the real battle was still ahead. What came next would be the hardest fight of their lives. But no matter what, they would face it together.